Evelyn Carter learned early that survival under chandeliers required choreography, a still chin for photographers, a half-laugh timed to Richard's punchlines, a graceful hand on his sleeve, as if the hand and the sleeve had always been married. The city called it elegance, but in private it was inventory of slights, of silences, of the way his voice could turn a breakfast table into a witness stand. He liked to begin with posture, as though a spine could be corrected like a ledger. "Sit up, don't look fragile," he'd say, and then he'd appraise her coffee as if cream were a scandal. The morning she nodded instead of arguing, he smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had bent a branch toward his preferred window. At night, he praised her beneath chandeliers, pressed practiced kisses on her cheek at hospital galas, and told donors she was the light of his life, a phrase polished by repetition to a glittering lie. Evelyn mastered a certain kind of breathing, quiet, count to 4, keep the room steady, because without breath, evidence is useless. She thought of her father's desk, the way he'd taught her to pair kindness with paper, records with mercy, every promise stapled to a date. That discipline steadied her the evening she crossed a restaurant lot and found Richard leaning into a softer shadow, his forefinger catching a lock of a younger woman's hair as if desire were a coin he could spend publicly. He saw Evelyn and registered not guilt but inconvenience, the way one notices rain on a good suit. At home, he called her paranoid and delicate, as if her wounds were decorations she'd chosen. He returned to his phone and left her to the ceiling, where she tried to file the humiliation somewhere it would not spill. 2 days later, hunting comfort, she drove to her sister's house and arrived unannounced, carrying the kind of hope that prefers not to admit its weight. Voices in the kitchen, Richard's low authority, Clara's eager echo, formed shapes that felt at first like a nightmare one can wake from, and then, with a single sentence, like salt poured into waking. "She's easy to handle," Richard said. "We'll take the company shares through the trust. She'll fold." Clara's laugh answered, bright and breaking. The words arranged themselves into a plot Evelyn had not given anyone permission to write. She pressed her palm to her mouth to cage the sound grief makes when it touches betrayal, then stepped back into the night as if distance were a cure. Driving home, the city blurred. Streetlights turned to commas that could not end a sentence. Inside the mansion, walls remembered every performance and returned none of it. The staircase held her without advice. Richard came in humming, poured himself a drink, and told her she was the burden he had the magnanimity to carry. In public, he reminded her he was the patient husband and she the cold heir, a story that fit the angle of every lens. Evelyn listened and did not argue. Arguments, she realized, were gifts to men who needed new weapons. The next morning brought a new tactic dressed as concern. Clara arrived with flowers and an intone polished to sound like care. "Are you eating?" she asked loudly, as though the house might quote her later. "Richard says you're forgetful, emotional, maybe unstable," she added softly, the way some people sheath knives. Evelyn blinked and stored the sentence beside all the others, not as proof the world would accept, but as a line to be validated when the right room finally listened. She walked the corridors and trained her hands not to shake. She visited her father's study and held the brass handle of the vault without turning it, testing if restraint could be stronger than rage. What she had, she told herself, was a name, a house that still held her footsteps, and a memory of a maxim: integrity outlasts deception. What he had was theater. Theater requires an audience. Let him gather one, let him boast, let him stack the stage with sympathy and fabrications and a sister rehearsing pity. Let him file petitions and hire cameras. When the curtain rose on his performance, she would arrive in black, carry one brown envelope, and trade choreography for consequence.
The petition arrived like weather that had been forming for months, gray, heavy, inevitable. delivered by a courier who would not meet Evelyn's eyes, as if shame were contagious. She slipped the envelope at the kitchen counter where her husband had once critiqued cream and posture, and saw in legal type the choreography of Richard's next act: dissolution, division, half of the estate, half of the name, half of the breath their city still mistook for his. By noon, headlines had already rehearsed the script: devoted husband seeks fairness, cold heiress refuses counseling, and the same cameras that had adored chandeliers now adored his grief. Church pews adjusted politely so that she sat with space around her, like a quarantine. A neighbor practiced sympathy that was really detection, asking, "Are you all right?" with a tone calibrated to harvest a quote. At the office, a board member she had once trusted placed a hand on a folder as if steadying it and said, "Optics are difficult, perhaps a temporary step back," a sentence that mistook reputation for reality. Evelyn measured every humiliation with the same quiet instrument: breath to 4, shoulders down, spine unbending. She called the family accountant Mr. Green, a man her father had praised for prudence, and sat in his dim office among orderly binders that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. He would not meet her gaze either. "Tell me there's no claim," she said. And because he had learned to speak the language of appearances, he talked about narratives and confidence, and how risk can look like negligence when viewed from the wrong angle. When she asked if money had changed the angle, he did not answer quickly enough. In the parking lot, she let grief run its loop, then turned to the only lesson that had ever rescued her: paper over noise. Richard had crowds, microphones, the smooth efficiency of a rumor with legs. She had calendars, copies, emails, signatures, the kind of patience that seems like weakness until a room is forced to weigh it. She reached out to Mr. Lawson, her father's old counsel, with a face carved by time and depositions, who arrived with questions that respected her mind. "What do you know, not what do you feel?" he asked. And she gave him dates, meetings, the smell of a lie when Clara rehearsed pity, the bracing rhythm of Richard's contempt, the peculiar consistency of a man who never contradicted himself unless he was sure no one kept minutes. "Good," Lawson said, sliding a legal pad across the table. "Now we will make the room listen." They set a cadence. Early mornings for walking the house and letting the noise drain. Late mornings for evidence, pulling contracts, reconciling calendars, requesting certified copies like fresh air. Afternoons for counsel, chain of custody, witness lists, a plan for silence that would not read as defeat. Evelyn learned a new posture, not the pretty one for photographs, but the stance of a woman who intends to be believed by a stranger with a gavel. Richard, intoxicated by his own press, doubled down. He gave interviews that treated cruelty as confession disguised as virtue, saying he had tried to help a fragile woman, and now sought only justice. Clara appeared at his side in a cream dress that pretended innocence and squeezed his arm at off-camera angles where she thought only empathy could see. Invitations evaporated like a tide going out. A luncheon canceled with apologies about tension, a charity board suddenly overscheduled, a friend's text that read, "Let's keep things low for a while," which meant, "You are inconvenient to be near." Evelyn stopped asking for explanations. Explanation is a favor owed by the honest. At night, she stood in her father's study and traced the grain of the desk with her fingertips until her pulse slowed. She did not open the vault. Not yet. Restraint is also a kind of power. She simply rehearsed the act of arriving, of placing one object on a bench when the room was finally ready to understand it. In the kitchen, the staff watched her with the gentle alarm of people who have learned to measure danger by the volume of a master's footstall. She thanked them for their work and standardized schedules because stability is contagious. When her phone lit with Richard's number and he purred, "They see you now the way I always have," she let the sentence sit between them like a lit match in a bowl of water, then ended the call without a word. She would not fight him where he was strong. She would make him speak in the only dialect he could not counterfeit, the dated, notarized, witnessed language of proof.
The night she finally opened the vault did not feel cinematic. It felt procedural, like washing one's hands before entering a clean room, like clicking a pen and aligning a stack of papers so the edges behave. And Evelyn took comfort in that small austerity as she turned the brass handle, keyed the code, and drew out the flat metal drawer where her father had stored things that should not be argued, only shown. Under wills and stock ledgers lay a plain brown envelope with her name written in his careful block letters, "For Evelyn, if you are betrayed." And when she slid it with a letter opener that had belonged to her grandmother, the room did not tilt or weep, it merely clarified. An ironclad prenuptial agreement with dates, exhibits, and Richard's signature bold as vanity. Notarizations that needed no flourish, an addendum initialed in the corner where a younger Evelyn had once worried about seeming unromantic, and a pragmatic father had insisted they respect love by protecting it from greed. Beneath those pages, a map of fraud disguised as spreadsheets, dummy vendors, overpayments recoiling through shell entities, wire confirmations that read like breadcrumbs. Tucked inside a smaller sleeve were printouts of emails Mr. Green had forwarded years ago to her father when certain reconciliations felt wrong, and a note in her father's hand, "Trust is a contract. Keep both." She sat at the desk and read the prenup 3 times, then the money trail twice, then closed her eyes to recite clauses aloud until her own voice steadied into the instrument she would need. When she called Mr. Lawson, he arrived in an hour with a portable scanner, tamper-evident bags, and a chain of custody log that demanded signatures like vows. Together they duplicated everything, stamped dates, sealed envelopes, and created a ledger of movement so clean even suspicion would have to shake its head and go to lunch. He placed the original prenup in a fireproof case and the fraud packet in another, labeled counsel copies, and scheduled an independent forensic accountant to verify the paths without knowing names. "We don't ambush," Lawson said. "We prepare a room where truth has no exit." Evelyn nodded and found the doing, photocopy, initial, seal, kept grief from inventing errands. Between steps, she thought of Clara's cream dresses and Richard's television voice and felt no heat, only the tired utility of plumbers tracing a leak. The next morning, she took the long route to the courthouse to observe without entering, counting the steps, weighing the light in the corridor, noting where cameras gathered and where they lost interest. In the afternoon, she met the forensic accountant, a woman who spoke in verbs and evidence, who followed each transaction like a hard path through snow, and said, "It will hold." That evening, she practiced holding the envelope, not like a trophy, but like a tool. She practiced placing it on a table and removing her hand. She practiced silence the way athletes practice breath at the wall. Richard, alive with interviews and the narcotic of public pity, texted a picture of himself on a rooftop, smiling into Clara's hair, moving on, finally free, and the text answered itself by not being answered. She archived it into a file named "For Tomorrow." She replaced "What will they think?" with "What can I show?" and replaced "Why did they?" with "Where is it written?" She standardized her sleep, an act of rebellion against chaos, and began each dawn with lists, docket numbers, certification requests, witness availability, security arrangements so she could enter and exit without theater. The staff noticed the quiet governance of her days and relaxed into schedules that did not ask them to read moods. The house exhaled. In a rare soft hour, she stood at the study window and watched rain draw clean lines on the glass, and understood at last why her father loved documents, because storms cannot argue with ink.
The morning of the hearing broke clean and hard, light skimming the courthouse's limestone like a blade, and the city arrived hungry for spectacle. cameras nesting on tripods, microphones thrust forward like flowers that had learned to interrogate. Richard answered them as if the steps were a stage he'd rented, navy suit knifed to his ribs, chin tipped to a sympathetic angle. Clara, a half step behind in cream, eyes lowered in a rehearsed softness that read as virtue until you learned to translate it. He said the words he'd memorized: loyal husband, fairness, concern, and the press fed each one into the day's first headlines while he slid a hand to the small of Clara's back, an off-timer gesture meant for editors who prefer narratives with easy lighting. Evelyn's car door opened without drama. She wore the black suit she had chosen for its lack of story, hair pinned without flourish, face quiet. Mr. Lawson met her on the curb with a nod that meant, "You are ready," and together they moved through the crush without borrowing its urgency. Staff guided them to courtroom 6A, a space that smelled faintly of varnish and old arguments, the gallery filled with spectators who had come for a fall, the way people attend concerts for the one note that breaks the glass. Richard's attorney, silver hair combed to a point, arranged binders with the pride of someone who believes paper is allegiance. Evelyn rested both palms on the table and counted her breath to 4, inhale, exhale, until her heart remembered the rate she had taught it. Judge Harrison entered with a presence that flattened the room's appetite. The clerk called the session to order, and the first volley began. Counsel's narrative of a man exhausted by a cold spouse, a fortune mismanaged, a legacy at risk. Mr. Green's name was invoked like an incantation, trusted, long time, objective, and photocopies thumped onto the bench as if weight were virtue. Clara watched from behind Richard's shoulder, offering small, timed glances of pity in Evelyn's direction, each one a bookmark for a later article. When the judge turned, his voice held no opinion, only work. "Mrs. Carter, do you wish to respond?" Evelyn rose, lifted the brown envelope with the care of someone handling a tool rather than a secret, and walked the length of tile that attorneys memorize in their shoes. "One item for the court," she said, and set it down. The judge opened it, his thumb running the edge as if testing the tooth of a blade, and read. A small sound, half breath, half laugh, escaped him at the prenuptial's first clause, the way relief leaks when an answer finally arrives in the dialect you prefer. "Mr. Carter," he said, holding the signature at an angle that made the navy suit look suddenly too bright. "Is this yours?" Richard began with charm, a soft shrug, the suggestion of context, but charm has a short half-life under fluorescent bulbs and recorders, and the document did not care for context. The judge continued through pages that mapped wire transfers like footprints drying in concrete, dates married to amounts, accounts to shell entities that didn't exist 2 weeks before an invoice appeared. He looked to counsel, to the back table where a junior associate stiffened, to Mr. Lawson, whose pen ticked only at necessary moments. The courtroom murmured, sensing the smell of a narrative changing direction. "We will set time for authentication and for questions regarding chain of custody and motive. But preliminarily, Mr. Carter, be aware that your petition asks this court to pretend a notarized witnessed agreement does not exist." He placed the prenup to one side as if removing a myth from the table. Richard's jaw tightened. Clara's hand drifted toward his sleeve and stopped midair when he did not offer it. Cameras in the back row clicked, tiny machines that don't understand shame but record it faithfully. Evelyn sat, hands flat, pulse steady. She did not smile. Victory was not the day's task. The task was clarity. Outside, somewhere, a headline began to rewrite itself. Inside, Harrison laid out the next steps with the boring mercy of process. Exhibits marked, a brief recess, expert testimony calendared, an admonition against media spin that could poison what's left of public patience for this room. As the clerk called the break, Richard leaned toward his counsel, whispering too sharply for secrecy. Clara stared at the seal on the wall as if it were an accusation. Evelyn remained still and let the moment pass through her like a weather front. Felt, documented, over. Then turned to Lawson, who tapped the chain of custody log with one finger and murmured, "On schedule." She nodded. The day had not ended anything yet. It had only forced the city to watch the right story begin.
Day 2 arrived stripped of theater, all fluorescent light and sworn oaths, and the room adjusted its appetite from gossip to proof. The forensic accountant took the stand with a stack of exhibits that made the gallery lean forward.
her voice level as she traced money the way surveyors trace boundaries. Date to transfer, transfer to account, account to shelf company organized a week before an invoice appeared. Each arrow a small refusal to be confused. Richard's attorney tried narrative first, context, business complexity, then tone. Isn't it true that... But complexity dissolved under ledgers the way fog dissolves under noon. When the accountant was finished, Mr. Green shuffled to the witness box, the phrase "trusted for years" hanging over him like a borrowed suit, and learned what it means to face a calendar that kept better memory than a man. Mr. Lawson's cross-examination was a soft dismantling. Why did your reconciliation methodology change the month Mr. Carter requested access? Who authorized that exception? Why do these emails, highlighted, disagree with your testimony? Green's answers found gravel. He reached for industry practice, but Lawson showed him the firm's own manual. He reached for oversight, but the timestamps contradicted oversight with intent. He reached for "I don't recall" and met a letter bearing his signature. Judge Harrison's pen stopped moving. He leaned forward, not unkind, but the way a doctor leans when telling a patient the truth will not be improved by adjectives. "Mr. Green," he said, "when evidence and recollection diverge, the court cannot privilege comfort." By mid-afternoon, Richard's charm had spent itself. He twitched against the chair, a man discovering that charisma is not a solvent for notarization. His counsel pivoted to personal injury, the exhausted husband, the cold wife, and the judge held up the prenuptial agreement as if holding a mirror. Its clauses plain: waiver of claim to inheritance, separation of corporate assets, acknowledgement of advisement. "You signed this," Harrison said, "not as accusation, but as gravity," and the last of the performance slid off the navy suit like rain off tempered glass. He turned to Clara in the first row, whose cream had taken on the color of paper left too long in sun. "Miss Hale," he said, voice even, "you are not a party. Nevertheless, the record contains communications, emails, texts, reflecting intent to undercut your sister's credibility through false claims of instability. This court notes it and expects it to stop." She opened her mouth and found that rehearsed pity has no lines for this scene. Then the decision came, not triumphant, but exact. Petition denied, dismissed with prejudice. A beat for silence. Furthermore, on the basis of exhibits entered today, this court refers specific financial transactions to the appropriate authorities for investigation. The gavel sounded like a door closing on a theater that had run too long. Sound rushed in, the scrape of benches, the small thunder of reporters standing, a hiss of whispered revisions as people hurried to shed last hour's certainty. Richard surged up, stopped, sat, stood again, finally committing to anger that read as flinch. When Clara reached for his arm, he shook off without looking, contempt suddenly public. Evelyn did not move. Her hands remained flat on the table, a metronome finding the tempo of ordinary days. She allowed no smile, because victory is a sugar that rots discipline. What she wanted to feel was not conquest, but relief that the room had done its job. Mr. Lawson slid the chain of custody log toward her and tapped the last signature line. She dated it and signed with a hand that did not shake. The judge rose, robe sighing, and the bailiff called a recess. In the quiet after footsteps, Lawson murmured, "The record is yours now." And Evelyn, without looking back, folded the certified copy of the prenup into her portfolio and stood. She glanced once at the seal on the wall, not as a worshiper, but as a citizen, then turned to the aisle. Around her, people rearranged their faces to accommodate truth.
It was not her work to guide them. She gathered the envelope, nodded to the clerk, and walked out of courtroom 6A the way she had come in, spine unbent, breath steady, leaving behind a man blinking under lights that finally refused to flatter.
Outside, the courthouse steps had already rewritten themselves into an amphitheater where yesterday's sympathies were being traded for today's questions, and as the doors swung open, microphones arced toward Evelyn like reeds in a current, the crowd parting on reflex to the scent of a new angle. She moved through the channel they made without haste, Mr. Lawson a calm shadow to her left, and when a reporter shouted, "How does it feel to win?" she did not give the city a pull quote to feed on, only a small nod that said the work had been done, and an even smaller word, grateful, which meant grateful for process rather than spectacle. Behind her, the weather changed around Richard. The same cameras that had adored his curated grief now interrogated his signatures, asking about dates and transfers with a briskness that ignored his charm. And he learned fast that the lens is faithful to story, but fickle to storytellers. Clara, stranded on the wrong side of a narrative, hovered at the photo's edge like a smudge editors would later crop, then reached for his hand in a reflex of self-preservation and found only air. At the curb, a young sound tech, too new to harden, lowered her boom and met Evelyn's eyes with a complicated expression that looked like apology for every headline she hadn't written. Evelyn held the gaze, offered a thank you that did not belong to any station, and slipped into the car. Inside, quiet arrived like a service, the door closing on the swarm with a seal that reminded her what rooms are for: shelter, work, rest. She loosened her shoulders, the simple miracle of a body remembering that danger was not the default, and counted to 4 on the inhale the way her father had taught her to reclaim mornings after long nights. Lawson cleared his throat, not to speak, but to mark a return to ordinary tempo. "You'll receive requests," he said finally, "for interviews, statements, redemption arcs. My advice?" She smiled into the window where the city slid by in soft panes. "Decline," she said. "Let the record speak." He nodded, pleased not to have to persuade her away from the honeyed trap of vindication. At home, the mansion greeted her without echo. The staff, who had learned to measure weather by the volume of a master's footfall, surfaced from their quiet choreography with careful smiles that did not ask for updates they had already read. She thanked them for holding the house steady and signed 2 time-off requests on the spot, because stability begins in schedules, not speeches. On the kitchen island, a neat stack of mail waited under a magnet shaped like a small brass key. Among envelopes with embossed return addresses sat a handwritten note from a vendor who'd extended terms during the storm. No need to respond, just proud to see the tide turn. And she filed it in a folder labeled Keep, a personal archive for proof that decency circulates even when headlines do not. She carried the brown envelope to the study, opened the fireproof case with the reverence one gives tools after they have done their job, and returned each document to its sleeve. Prenup to the left, fraud map to the right, chain of custody copies centered as if balance were something paper could model for the rest of life. She did not linger to savor. Relief, she understood, loses its virtue when it becomes theater. Instead, she pulled a yellow legal pad and built the next day in 3 columns: company, legal, personal, assigning verbs to each. Audit vendor ledger anomalies, instruct counsel to draft restitution notices, call Mrs. Delgado from HR to confirm training dates, text Pastor Ruth to thank her for the quiet pew she'd kept open, set the piano for a half-hour of scales, because hands deserve competence that has nothing to do with fortune. Her phone buzzed against the wood with the violence of news. 3 national shows offering prime time. 1 glossy magazine promising a profile in your own words. An email from a publicist she hadn't hired, confident she would want to control the narrative.
Evelyn declined with a template Lawson's office had prepared, brief, courteous, final. And when a journalist she respected requested a conversation off the record, she replied with a single line, "When litigation is concluded, I will publish the filings. They can speak for me." In the late light, she walked the perimeter of the garden her mother had once kept, pruning a rose that had overreached, staking a stem coaxed low by rain, and felt the fatigue arrive not as heaviness, but as permission. Integrity, she thought, is not a banner, but a backbone you remember when the room empties. As dusk drew the windows into mirrors, she slid a card beneath the blotter where another waited. Yesterday's vow, tell the truth, then build, and added a second sentence, plain as a floor, begin again tomorrow. Then she turned out the lamp, closed the study door, and let the house settle around her as if exhaling at last.
Return was not an event, but a discipline, and Evelyn treated it like any other system worth trusting. She calendared it, assigned owners, measured outcomes, and refused to confuse applause with progress. On Monday, she walked into the glass tower that had buzzed with speculative pity 2 weeks earlier, and felt the lobby's murmur dip, then recompose itself around her, as if the building were deciding to remember what it was for, work, not rumor. And in the boardroom, she set a narrow agenda that left no room for elegies. Vendor exposures first, then internal controls, then restitution strategy. She did not mention the courthouse or the headlines because the company's arteries did not beat to gossip, they beat to cash, ethics, and delivery. She began with a ledger of harms, the late fee penalties from shaken partners, the extra hours compliance had spent defending clean accounts from dirty innuendo, the erosion in a pair of key client renewals, and then matched each with a corresponding remedy. Fee waivers negotiated and documented, a new vendor onboarding checklist that forced beneficial ownership disclosures up front, a quarterly attestation signed by department heads and sampled by audit, not because signatures make people honest, but because they make dishonesty traceable. When a director cleared his throat with the ritual inquiry about optics, she offered numbers instead of wounds. Churn sliding down 2 points since the hearing. Pipeline momentum up 3. Risk-weighted exposure halved by a single renegotiated contract. Proof, in other words, that integrity amortizes. She promoted a mid-level analyst named Kimi, who had raised a hand when it was unfashionable, and built for her a small team tasked with pre-incident truth, a phrase that made a few brows twitch and then relax when they saw the charter. Scenario testing, policy drills, red team memos written in verbs, not fog. HR briefed a whistleblower program that didn't just exist but functioned. A third-party hotline with a 24-hour acknowledgement SLA and a public dashboard counting submissions and resolutions without names. Finance received permission to be exacting enough to look unkind. Legal, with Lawson as outside counsel, sketched restitution letters to vendors harmed by Richard's schemes because justice without repair is theater under a different marquee. After lunch, she visited departments that had turned quiet during the storm and listened without interrupting. In logistics, she learned that a rumor can move pallets. In product, she found 2 engineers who had built a dashboard to surface anomalies when invoices disguised as consulting tried to slip through procurement. She thanked them in the meeting, then later in writing, because culture calcifies around whatever you reward. Back at her desk, she signed a standing rule that the company would not brief gossip, no sources close to, no anonymous friends, and she added the corollary that when they aired, they would say so aloud with dates, fixes, and a contact person prepared to answer questions in complete sentences. In the late afternoon,
Clara texted from a new number with the kind of contrition that believes pain is a doorbell. "Please, I'm sorry, I was manipulated. Can we talk?" And Evelyn typed, deleted, then sent the boundary she had practiced in the mirror. "I wish you a life of honesty and peace. That does not mean access to mine." She set the phone face down and returned to the work that would outlast even this day's ache. Toward evening, she sat with the compliance team and the forensic accountant and built a schedule for document preservation that looked less like retaliation and more like hygiene. Legal holds, mirrored drives, sworn custodians, each step a brick under the phrase her father had written to her in another crisis: "Trust is a contract. Keep both." Before she went home, she stopped by the custodial closet where Mr. Otiano, who had kept the building's floors immaculate while rumors tried to stain them, was coiling an extension cord. She thanked him for the ordinary mercy of clean thresholds and slid 2 tickets to his daughter's school performance into his shirt pocket, a small pairing of gratitude with action that felt truer than any speech. The sun had gone soft by the time she reached the lobby, and as the elevator doors closed, she caught her reflection unstartled for the first time in months. Upstairs, the house greeted her without flinching. In the study, she retrieved the card beneath the blotter, "Tell the truth, then build," and added the next incremental commandment that had carried her through the day's unglamorous victories: "Protect the quiet that protects the work." Then she set her alarm for an hour earlier than she preferred, because return, like strength, grows when you feed it before anyone is watching.
A year later, the house learned a new silence, less like absence, more like a room that has remembered its purpose, and Evelyn moved through it with a steadiness that did not require armor. Mornings began with the garden and a loop around the perimeter where she cut back what had overreached, tied what needed help, and left strong stems alone. A management philosophy written in roses, then coffee at the study window where the city woke in pains. And she read without doom the docket updates that tracked Richard's unraveling. Indictments formalized, co-conspirators named, a plea from a junior associate who had thought fraud was just another department. It was not triumph she felt reading these, but a calibrated relief that consequence had found its place on the calendar. Clara had moved twice, then tried again with a letter that smelled of a scented hope Evelyn recognized from their childhood. An apology that wanted to be a key. "I was lost. He used me. Please let me back." And Evelyn's reply was a gift without access. "I wish you health and honesty. That is all I can give." Boundaries, she had learned, are love with edges. At the company, the slow work had become culture. The whistleblower dashboard showed fewer submissions because processes did not invite the same shadows. Kemi's pre-incident truth team sent quarterly memos that read like action rather than theater. The restitution program completed its final payment to a vendor that had carried them when gossip bit their receivables, and Evelyn signed the note that accompanied it with a sentence that had guided her repairs: "Justice includes repair." She still kept the brown envelope, now sealed in its case and filed under Resolved Tools, not as a relic to stroke when fear prowled, but as a reminder that love had not ailed her. It had taught her to tell the truth and then build. She returned to the scholarship ceremony her mother had loved, standing at the edge of a stage while a young woman from the South Side thanked donors for a chance to study forensic accounting, because numbers tell stories too. And Evelyn felt, unexpectedly, something like joy that did not reference survival. On Sundays, she took the long road home along the river, letting traffic belong to people in a hurry, and practiced the piano for half an hour, because competence that has nothing to do with money repairs the private self. Her scales were still clumsy, but they were honest.
When a glossy magazine proposed a cover titled "The Woman Who Won," she declined with the same 8-word email she always used. "The filings speak. I have work to do." And when a producer suggested a limited series, "From Your Point of View," Lawson laughed and she smiled. Storytelling without stewardship was just another chandelier. She still walked past the courthouse some mornings, not to haunt the scene of a reversal, but to confirm that rooms like that exist and sometimes work. In her pocket, a folded card lived with 3 lines she had written over the months. "Tell the truth, then build. Protect the quiet that protects the work. Begin again tomorrow." A creed small enough to carry and large enough to live inside. At night, she occasionally dreamed the old dream, the parking lot, a hand in someone else's hair. But even there the ending had changed. She turned and walked toward a door that opened, not away from one that slammed. The city had largely moved on, as cities mercifully do, and Evelyn let it. She did not need monuments, only schedules that honored the ordinary. On the anniversary of the hearing, she hosted a dinner for the unglamorous heroes: compliance, night security, custodial. No speeches, no toasts, just bread warm enough to dissolve, water cold enough to bless, laughter that belonged to people who had risked being dull and right. She sent each home with a simple card that read, "Integrity outlasts deception," not as a slogan, but as observed fact. Before sleep, she checked the garden once more, pinched a spent bloom, and looked back at the house that had learned to breathe with her. She turned off the last lamp, set tomorrow's list on the blotter, and let the dark come, a friend that no longer needed watching.